behalf of the association, I would, and we're starting now. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Ohio Oil and Gas Association, I would like to welcome everyone to a webinar on PHMSA's new gas gathering rules. I know this has been a topic of interest for several years for members, and it's been quite the road to get to this point of a final rule. We're very fortunate to have Keith Coyle joining us this morning to give us a briefing on what the rule is and what it means to our membership. Keith is an attorney and a shareholder at Baps Calland Law Firm, who we've collaborated with on previous regulatory issues. He's quite knowledgeable in this subject area. I want to thank him again for his participation today. We have allocated 1 hour for this webinar. We should have some time for questions at the end, but if there are some specific questions you have as we're going through the slides, please use the chat function to get those out there, and we'll stop the presentation accordingly to get those in, or save some of them for the end, depending on the nature of the questions. I'll go ahead and take a shot at answering the first question. Yes, slides will be available, and yes, this will be recorded. So I just want to knock that out to clear up any confusion there. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Keith and for a briefing on the new PHMSA rule. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Andrew and Brad. Really appreciate the opportunity to provide this update on PHMSA's gas gathering rule for the Ohio Oil and Gas Association. I have worked with UGA and several UGA member companies on these issues for quite a long time now. I always forget how long this rulemaking has been going until I do one of these briefings, and then I realize it's been 10 years. But really excited, really grateful to have the opportunity to talk to everybody today. And the topic for our discussion this morning is PHMSA's new rules for onshore gas gathering lines. In terms of how we're going to lay things out this afternoon, I've got a brief overview slide here just to orient you to how the conversation is going to proceed. I'm going to start with a little bit of a background on PHMSA's current rules for onshore gas gathering lines. We'll talk a little bit about definitions. We'll talk about the two kinds or categories of gathering lines that are currently regulated, type A and type B lines. And then we'll talk about the exemption for gathering lines in class 1 locations. After we finish the current rules, we'll talk about the key components that are in the new final rule. We'll introduce the concepts about how you determine if a pipeline qualifies as one of the new categories of gathering lines. These are going to be the type C lines and the type R lines. We'll explain a little bit about what type C and type R mean. And then we'll talk about a limitation on the incidental gathering provision that's in the final rule. And then we'll close out the overview of the final rule topics with a discussion about deadlines that are important for compliance purposes. And finally, I'll do a quick overview of some recent developments related to the final rule. That portion of the discussion is going to focus primarily on a motion to stay and petition for reconsideration of the final rule that was filed last month by 2 industry trade organizations. I'm going to do a lot of talking this afternoon, but I think Andrew explained, if you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to let Andrew know in the chat function or Brad know. I'm more than happy to stop and address questions. Your questions are probably more important than anything I have to say today. So don't be shy. And there's a good chance if you have a question that somebody else is thinking the same thing. So please use this opportunity to ask questions if you have them. So in terms of PHMSA's current rules for onshore gas gathering lines, PHMSA established the current regulations for gas gathering lines in a 2006 final rule. There are several key components in the current rules for gathering. The first key component is figuring out if your pipeline qualifies as a gathering line under PHMSA's regulations in Part 192. The way that that is done under the current rules is operators are directed to follow the provisions in API RP80, the first edition. API RP80 is a recommended practice that API developed in the early 2000s, and it provides guidance to pipeline operators for making determinations on whether the pipeline that they are operating qualifies as a gathering line. And there are two important basic concepts that are embedded in API RP80. The first is determining the potential endpoint of production operations, and the second is determining the endpoint of gathering operations. Those two determinations can be pretty complicated. RP80 is a pretty complex document. But in terms of, for purposes of today's discussion, the two concepts to remember is, first, you have to figure out where production operations end. And second, you need to figure out where gathering operations end. And RP80 gives you 5 potential endpoints. There's a point of commingling, a gas processing plant, a compressor station, a treatment facility, or there's a 5th endpoint that is known as incidental gathering. And incidental gathering is important because it's one of the provisions that's been limited under the final rule. If I could simplify what an incidental gathering line is, it is basically a pipeline that delivers gas from one of the other 4 endpoints I talked about to the connection with another pipeline, typically a transmission line, but it can also be a distribution line. So an easy way to think about it is an incidental gathering line is basically the last pipeline segment in a gathering system. It's going to take the gas from one of those other endpoints and deliver it to another pipeline for further transportation downstream. Now, under the current rules in Part 192, RP80 is subject to some limitations in the regulations. Those limitations are specified in 192.8. So there's a limitation on the use of production equipment, dual use production equipment, something that could be used in production operations or transportation operations. And then there's some other endpoints, superseding endpoints that are provided for commingling of gas, compressors, processing plants. We're not really going to talk about any of those other endpoints, but we will talk about one of the new endpoints later on that deals with incidental gathering. So once you figure out if your pipeline is a gathering line under the current PHMSA regulations, then you need to figure out if the gathering line is regulated under the rules. And the way that the rules are currently structured, there are 2 categories of regulated gas gathering lines. The first are known as type A, and the second are known as type B. Type A lines are going to be your higher stress or your higher pressure gathering lines in more populated class 2, class 3, or class 4 locations. If you have one of these higher stress, higher operating pressure gathering lines, you're going to need to follow the requirements for gas transmission lines, subject to certain exceptions, including for integrity management. The other type of regulated gathering line is known as a type B gathering line. These are going to be lower stress or lower operating pressure lines, and they're going to be in class 2, class 3, or class 4 locations. I put an asterisk on the class 2 because there are 3 methods that are allowed under the current rules for the class 2 determination, and there is a way that a low stress, low pressure class 2 line can fall out of the rules. So for these type B gathering lines, you're going to follow gas transmission design, construction, testing requirements, again with some exceptions. You're going to have to do corrosion control, compliance with the rules for plastic pipe and components. But you only have to follow certain discrete or limited operation and maintenance requirements. And that's one of the key differences between type A and type B is you don't have to follow all of the operation and maintenance requirements that apply for gas transmission. You only have to deal with a set of requirements. And the last thing that's important under the current rules is an exemption. Under the current PHMSA regulations, gas gathering lines in Class 1 locations are not regulated at all. They are not subject to the substantive safety standards in Part 192, and they're also not subject to any of the reporting requirements in Part 191. Now, PHMSA included that exemption in the 2006 final rule at a time before a lot of unconventional oil and gas development occurred in the United States. And what PHMSA would tell you is that that exemption made sense in a pre-shale gas world where we had smaller diameter, lower risk gathering lines, but that it doesn't make sense today given the installation of larger diameter, higher risk gathering lines in Class 1 locations that look more like transmission lines. So I talked about that 2006 final rule. Now I wanted to give you some of the procedural history as to what led up to the final rule that PHMSA issued last month. So this whole rulemaking process started more than a decade ago with the publication of an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And that advance notice of proposed rulemaking had questions from PHMSA about a lot of topics. And one of the topics that they asked for public comment on is whether they should revise the current rules for onshore gas gathering lines. PHMSA received comments from the public on that question. And then in April of 2016, they published a notice of proposed rulemaking that contained a set of proposed changes to PHMSA's regulations for onshore gas gathering lines. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over what was in the NPRM, but just know that they proposed changes to the reporting requirements and also to the substantive safety standards. Now, the way that the PHMSA rulemaking process works is if PHMSA makes proposed changes to the gas pipeline safety regulations, they have to present that proposal to a federal advisory committee for review. And that federal advisory committee is known as the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee in PHMSA land, or the GPAC. And what the GPAC does, it's a 15-member body. There's 5 members from the public, 5 from industry, and 5 from government. They're charged with reviewing PHMSA's proposed gas pipeline rulemakings and providing recommendations on whether those rulemakings should proceed. The GPAC is an important public-facing body. They do have a lot of influence on how PHMSA conducts its rulemaking process, but the recommendations and the votes that GPAC makes, they aren't binding on PHMSA. But the statute does require PHMSA, if they're going to disagree with the GPAC recommendation, to provide reasons for doing so when they issue the final rule. So in June of 2019 is when the GPAC actually got around to reviewing this PHMSA gas gathering rule. The reason that it took so long was the April 2016 rulemaking proposal didn't just include provisions related to gathering. It included provisions related to gas transmission as well. It was known as the mega rule. Note to self, do not ever call a rule the mega rule in federal rulemaking process. But it took a long time for PHMSA to get all of the gas transmission provisions in front of the GPAC to get a recommendation. And then it took them even longer to get things in front of the GPAC on the gas gathering side because they had to cancel some previously scheduled meetings. But in any event, PHMSA got the GPAC to review and provide recommendations on the gathering proposals in June of 2019. And then in November 15th of 2021 is when PHMSA published the final rule in the Federal Register. The timing of the final rule was somewhat important. PHMSA actually released a pre-publication version of the final rule earlier in November to coincide with President Biden's trip to Scotland as part of the big climate summit. They also released an EPA think it was a rulemaking proposal on the same day. So this PHMSA final rule for gathering was part of a coordinated effort on the part of the administration to advance rulemakings related to methane emissions reductions and greenhouse gases as part of this climate summit. So what is in this new final rule? At a high level, what I would say is there are, 4 big components in the final rule. The first is the final rule creates 2 new categories of gathering lines. There are type C gathering lines, which are certain gas gathering lines in class 1 locations that meet certain specified criteria, which we'll discuss in some of the later slides. And if you qualify as a type C gathering line, you are going to be subject to the reporting requirements in Part 191, as well as safety standards in Part 192. There's another new category of gathering line that's been created that's known as a type R line. And the type R line is a reporting only gathering line. So the definition for type R is basically anything other than a type A, type B, or type C line. These are known as type R lines. And if you're an operator of a type R line, you need to comply with the incident reporting requirements and the annual reporting requirements in PHMSA's Part 191 reporting regulations. You do not have to comply with any other provisions in Part 191 or any of the other safety standards in Part 192 for type R lines. The 2 other things that I'm going to go over is one is a provision that limits the use of the incidental gathering provision in RP 80. And then I'll close things out by talking a little bit about some of the important deadlines. What you'll see on the screen here is a chart that we prepared laying out what the key provisions are for the type C gathering lines. The reason that we structured it this way is because the language in the final rule it's pretty complicated and convoluted to figure out what exactly applies, because the requirements that apply vary based on the diameter of the pipe and essentially the proximity of the pipe to buildings intended for human occupancy. And the way PHMSA wrote the rule was to apply a bunch of requirements in the beginning of the regulation and then take a bunch of requirements away on the backside if you met certain exceptions. So to sort of keep things lined up and sane in my mind, I've tended to want to work with a chart on this. But at the top of the chart, you will see under the type C header there, the basic criteria that need to be met for you to qualify as a type C line. So it's got to be a gathering line in a class 1 location, and it has to operate, it has to be one of the higher stress or higher operating pressure lines. So the MEOP needs to produce a hoop stress that is greater than or equal to 20% of specified minimum yield strength for metallic lines, or it has to be greater than 125 PSIG for non-metallic piping, or if you have metallic piping and you can't do a specified minimum yield strength calculation because you don't have sufficient data. So those are the 2 sort of main distinguishing features. You have to be class 1, and you have to be one of these higher stress level or higher operating pressure lines. Then when you proceed down into the chart, you will see that the nature of the compliance obligations that you need to follow vary. And the way that they vary are based on certain diameter thresholds. There's 3. And based on whether or not there are buildings intended for human occupancy or other impacted sites near the pipeline. So if we start all the way on the right of the chart, you'll see the greater than 16-inch line category. Those lines are subject to the most stringent requirements under the rule, and they're listed in the column below. Kind of a good shorthand way of thinking about it is for greater than 16-inch, you're following all the requirements for type B gathering lines, plus emergency response. There's some nuances and wiggle in there, but that's basically what the chart shows. So they're the most stringently regulated. When you start to move back to the left, and you get into these two other diameter thresholds, you'll see that the compliance obligations will vary depending on the size of the pipe and depending on whether or not there is a building intended for human occupancy or other impacted site. So in terms of the diameter breakdowns, you will see that there are two key diameter breakdowns: greater or equal to 8 inches. I'm going to use 8 inches because that's just an easier way of talking about it. Up to 12 inch, and then greater than 12 inches up to 16 inch. Now, what you'll notice is if there are no buildings intended for human occupancy or other impacted sites, the requirements for those lines are the same. So that's a good thing. But then you'll also notice as you go down on the chart, if there is a building intended for human occupancy or other impacted site, the requirements for those two diameter categories or thresholds vary. And the way that I marked it on the chart is if you see a plus in the column, that means it's an additional requirement on top of the requirements that are provided in the row above. So you're probably thinking, all right, well, how do I figure out if I have a building intended for human occupancy or other impacted site? The rule provides you with two methods for doing that. Method one is to do a potential impact radius calculation and determine if there are any buildings intended for human occupancy or other impacted sites within the potential impact circle for the pipeline. Now, a PIR calculation is it's pretty standard in the gas transmission world. It's used in the integrity management rules. PHMSA took that calculation and used it in this rule as a means of determining what the potential impact radius for a gathering line would be. And then if you have one of these, if you have a building intended for human occupancy or another impacted site within the PIR for the pipeline, PHMSA said you need to follow additional or enhanced requirements. That's method one. The other method that PHMSA allows you to use is the standard class location method, which is basically you look at the sliding mile for the gathering line segment. And if there are any buildings intended for human occupancy or other impacted sites within the sliding mile, you're subject to enhanced safety requirements. Now, I will tell you that basically in every scenario, use of the method two, the class location method, is going to end up subjecting the pipe to more regulation than would otherwise be required if you follow the PIR method. It's much more likely that the direct regulatory impact will be minimized if you do a PIR calculation. Now, there are very likely going to be things or impacts on unregulated segments or segments that fall outside of the PIR if you choose to use the PIR method. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, my understanding is if you're going to do corrosion control in a pipeline segment, you're not just going to do it on the part of the segment that's within the PIR. You're probably going to have to do some things on portions of the segment that fall outside of the PIR to make sure that you're meeting compliance for the portions that are within the PIR. But those are the basic concepts in Type C world. So you have the basic criteria laid along the top of the chart. You have regulatory requirements that vary based on the diameter of the pipe, as well as whether the pipe has a building intended for human occupancy or other impacted site using one of the two methods. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Type R lines. These are easier to explain. The Type R lines are basically everything else that is left. If a pipeline does not qualify as a Type A, B, or C gathering line, by definition, it's a Type R line. For the most part, Type R lines are going to be lines in Class 1 locations that don't meet the Type C criteria, either because the lines are too small, they're smaller than 8 inches, or because they operate at low pressures or low stress levels. Those lines will fall out of Type C regulation and become Type R. There is another limited Type B line that can fall out. Those Type B lines in Class 2 locations, if you use one of the alternative methods, it's possible that that line could fall out and be Type R as well. But for type R lines, your obligations are basically the filing of incident reports and annual reports with PHMSA. You will not need to file safety-related condition reports. You will not need to provide information to the National Pipeline Mapping System. So the nature, these are basically data collection or information collection reporting obligations for the type R line. Another thing that's worth mentioning is incidental gathering. So PHMSA basically left the current definitions in place in the final rule. So you're still following the first edition of RP 80 and determining if your pipeline is a gathering line. Those determinations are still subject to the existing endpoints, superseding endpoints in 192 for some of the gathering endpoints like points of commingling, compressor stations, processing plants. But PHMSA also added this new overriding limitation for incidental gathering lines. And what PHMSA says in the rulemaking language is that if an incidental gathering line extends 10 or more miles from another endpoint, that line has to be treated as a transmission line. There's been some confusion, concern over the language that PHMSA used in the regulation in making that limitation effective. If you read the final rule in the preamble, it suggests that PHMSA is primarily thinking about entirely new lines that are constructed. And if that entirely new incidental gathering line extends 11 miles, you have to treat the whole line, all 11 miles, as transmission. What's not clear under the rule text is, let's say I have an 11-mile or 12-mile existing incidental gathering line, and I replace mile 6. Does that have the legal effect of transforming all 11 miles to transmission? And that's something that GPA and API, I'll talk about the petition for reconsideration, but that's one of the points of clarification that the industry has asked for on that limitation. But
Hey, Keith,
yeah,
this is Andrew. Can I interrupt you for just one minute? I think we have a question that's relevant to that slide you just mentioned, related to incidental gathering lines or incidental gathering. And the question is, why is incidental gathering only limited to newly installed pipelines? Do you have any insight on the discussions there, the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So in the rulemaking proposal, PHMSA wanted to limit incidental gathering to 1 mile in length. That was their mileage cutoff. API, after the proposed rule was issued, they developed a second edition of RP80 that included a mileage limitation on incidental gathering. I think the mileage limitation in the second edition of RP80 is 20 miles. So PHMSA sort of split the baby and they picked 10 miles. There were some comments in the rulemaking that suggested that a 10-mile cutoff might be appropriate, but anyways, that's where they came up with the 10 miles. Now, in terms of wanting to make that 10-mile limitation prospective, I think the reason that they did that was to avoid imposing additional compliance burdens on existing lines. So say, for instance, PHMSA required any replacement of an incidental gathering line that was, more than a mile in length or something like that. The effect of that is to subject those existing incidental gathering lines to full regulation as transmission lines. And those lines would definitely have challenges, in my opinion, in complying with all of the transmission rules, including the integrity management requirements and the new requirements for MAOP and pipeline materials verification. So I hope that PHMSA's idea of trying to limit the 10 miles to new lines was to make the compliance burden easier for industry to absorb. So it's a lot easier to build a new pipeline to transmission line standards and operate it that way from day one than it is to have an existing incidental gathering line of whatever length become subject to full regulation as transmission. The older the line is, the harder compliance is going to be. The records probably aren't going to be great. So I hope that the reason they structured it that way was to minimize the compliance impact. Do you think I covered that?
Yeah, yes, Keith, I do.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. A couple of other points on the final rule or provisions worth noting. One, there is an obligation under the final rule to document the beginning and end points of gathering. There's a compliance deadline for that. I'll point it out when we get there. But this is a new documentation requirement that's put in 192 that requires operators to document the beginning and end points of gathering. One of the questions that I have is how far is PHMSA or the certified state authority is going to push that documentation requirement? You know, is just having the procedure laid out that you use to classify the assets enough? Are they going to require you to list the specific beginning and end points for each asset? Are they going to require you to show the math or the rationale for how you chose those endpoints? So depending on how that documentation requirement is interpreted and enforced, it could be more challenging. Another provision that's included in the final rule is there's basically a way that operators can be allowed to use composite pipe material in new or replaced type C lines. Composite pipe materials are currently not authorized for use under Part 192. So if you have those materials in a pipeline system, if you want to use the materials in a regulated service, the way PHMSA set things up now is you have to go ask them for a waiver or a special permit. What the final rule does for type C gathering is it allows you to use this 90-day prior notification provision where you can notify PHMSA that you want to install composite pipe in a type C line. You've got to provide a bunch of information as part of the notification, but there's an opportunity for PHMSA to authorize that if they don't object. One other important thing to remember is that existing composite pipe material that's in existing systems that becomes regulated by operation of law under the rule, those lines it's okay to use composite in those lines. Those lines are what are known as grandfathered pipelines. And if you're grandfathered under the PHMSA rules, you don't need to comply with the design, construction, initial testing, initial inspection requirements. So that's a good thing. The other side of the coin there is once you start to replace composite pipe material, you lose that grandfathering provision. I'll talk a little bit more in the next bullet here about an exception for grandfathering. But as you start to replace composite pipe material, you may be required to get authorization, this prior notice, before you put the pipe into the system. So that's something to think about, and definitely for if you're building new type C lines and you want to use composite, you'll need to follow that notification process. The last thing on this slide is a 40-foot exception this is a broadly applicable exception for type C lines. PHMSA wrote the rule and said 40 feet or less, and this is for grandfathered type C lines. If you're a type C line in existence on the date the final rule goes into effect, if you replace 40 feet or less of that type C line, you do not need to comply with the design, installation, construction, initial testing, and initial inspection requirements. So this is basically a small pipe segment exception that allows you to put in small pipe segments without having to do full Part 192 compliance. A little bit of a discussion about the key deadlines in the final rule. The first is May 16th, 2022. That is the effective date of the final rule. So what's an effective date? An effective date is basically when the language in the Code of Federal Regulations will actually change to show the new provisions that have been added under this final rule. So the rule was published in November of 2021. The Code of Federal Regulations does not change on the date of the rule's publication. It changes on the date of the rule's effective date. And in this case, PHMSA had a 6-month deadline before the rule became effective. So on May 16th of 2022 is when the language in the regulations will actually change. But if you go online on the ECFR right now, you will see notations to the amendments that will become effective on the relevant rulemaking provisions. The other thing that happens on May 16, 2022 is the new reporting requirements go into effect for type C lines and for type R lines. So just remember that, at least under the rules currently written, if you have an incident that occurs on a type C or type R line on May 16th or later, you will be subject to the incident reporting requirements. The next key deadline is November 16th of 2022. This is where you need to have that documentation in place for your beginning and endpoints for gathering. That deadline, you can actually ask PHMSA, request that they authorize an alternative compliance deadline for that provision. You need to follow that same 90-day prior notice where you can file a request to have that deadline extended to a new date. You have to provide reasons and justifications. I don't know how generous PHMSA will be in granting those requests for alternative compliance deadlines. I also don't know if they will grant requests with conditions. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. Next deadline to be aware of is March 15th of 2023. That's when the first annual reports will be due to PHMSA for type C lines and type R lines. And then the last deadline is May 16th of 2023. This is when operators need to come into compliance with the rules for type C gathering lines. Again, there is a way that an operator can ask PHMSA for an alternative compliance deadline if they provide reasons and supporting information. I wanted to talk a little bit about the cost benefit analysis because I think it ties into some of the recent developments. One of the key concerns that industry had throughout the rulemaking process was PHMSA's cost benefit analysis of the proposed rule. And we saw many of those same concerns pop up again on the final rule. You'll see on the slide that in the final regulatory impact analysis, PHMSA estimated operators would experience $13.7 million in annualized compliance costs. I will say that there was significant comments in the record, including a 300-page economic study that API prepared that showed that the compliance costs will not be $13.7 million per year. They will be significantly higher than that. And a couple of things to point out or assumptions that PHMSA made in reaching that number. One is that they pointed to some data that the IPAA had supplied the agency back in 2006 when they established the current rules. PHMSA pointed to that data as the best available cost information. I think that's a stretch given the number of comments that were submitted in the rulemaking proceeding and the availability of a 300-page economic analysis from industry, but I'll leave that where it is. Another thing to point out for the final regulatory impact analysis is that the analysis itself identified that another alternative was less costly and more beneficial. And that alternative was basically only regulating class 1 gathering with diameters greater than 12.75 inches. So basically the cost benefit analysis showed that if PHMSA limiting the rule for type C requirements to greater than 12-inch lines would have been more cost beneficial. And then there were just other questionable assumptions included in the economic analysis. So what PHMSA's regulations allow people to do in a rulemaking proceeding is to file what's known as a petition for reconsideration of a final rule. A petition for reconsideration needs to be filed within 30 days of the final rule's publication date, and 2 industry trade organizations, GPA Midstream Association and the American Petroleum Institute, filed a petition for reconsideration of this final rule. They submitted that petition on December 15th of last year. When they filed the petition, they also submitted a motion for a stay. And the motion for stay was basically a targeted request that PHMSA put certain compliance obligations on pause pending resolution of the petition for reconsideration. And the compliance obligations that the motion targeted are basically the ones that would kick in the earliest. the ones that go into effect on the effective date of the final rule, which is May of this year. So in that motion, they basically asked PHMSA to pause those compliance obligations pending resolution of the petition. In the petition, API and GPA asked PHMSA to reconsider the compliance deadlines for type C lines, to push those out several years. I think the structure that the petition asked for was a 3-year window to handle pipelines that are greater than 12 inches, and then another 3-year window beyond that to handle the 8 to 12 inch lines. And then API and GPA also asked for relief from some of the provisions that apply to the 8 to 12 inch category of pipelines, the smaller lines, basically the enhanced requirements that apply if there's a building intended for human occupancy or other impacted site. There have been some other industry trade organizations that have filed letters of support. PIOGA and MSC have done that. I know that API and GPA are very interested in receiving additional letters of support. The more the merrier. I do think that showing the regulator that industry supports what's in the petition and needs relief is a good thing. There is a policy deadline that PHMSA has adopted in its rules that says they will issue a decision on a petition for reconsideration within 90 days of the rules publication. So that 90-day deadline runs in February of 2022. Or if they're not going to meet that deadline, they're supposed to provide notice in the Federal Register of when they're going to decide the petition. I will be quite honest with you. I am betting the over on PHMSA getting this petition decided by February 13th. This is a rulemaking process that took 10 years to decide. There was a lot of information that was put in the petition. I don't think they're going to get it decided by February 13th. I hope, knock on wood, that they decide it before the effective date of the final rule in May, or if they're not going to do that, that they grant the stay and then get the thing decided sometime over the summer. So that is everything that I had in terms of slides. I am more than happy to spend some time answering any questions that folks might have if they want to put them in the chat or chime in. I don't know if Andrew received anything else at this point.
Yeah, I have at least one question through the chat. I do have a question on your last slide, though, on the petition, and you said you'd welcome additional letters of support. Would it still be timely to file those letters? I understand that is there a deadline associated with that submission?
No, so the letters of support, in terms of, I think they would be timely. The letters of support aren't designed to make the parties who submit them interveners in the proceeding or parties to the petition. The time for filing the petition and the parties on the petitions have been identified. I think it's more of a, we are submitting these letters to just show support, and I think they're timely. Anything that's submitted before these things get decided is timely, because it's more of a way, to show support to the industry and to the agency.
Thanks, Keith. All right, let me move on to some of these questions through the chat. Does the final rule touch on isolation requirements between interconnecting gathering lines? For example, when a lateral line, like a spur line, ties into the trunk line, will it be required to have isolation on the lateral line at the tie-in location?
So I think that's one of those things that's going to come up in understanding compliance obligations imposed in subpart I for corrosion control. I think the answer to that question is going to depend on, one, whether the segments qualify as type C lines. And if they do, what do you need to do from a compliance perspective to meet your obligations under subpart I? And I think the answer to that question is probably going to vary, because when you get out into the real world, I assume there are going to be some tie-ins that are in fully regulated type C, both the existing segment and the tie-in segment are going to be parts of type C, or maybe there might be situations where neither segment is regulated, but there could be some corrosion control related impact downstream where you might need to do something related to those segments to protect the downstream pipe.
Okay, thanks for that. So a typical lawyer response, it depends. I'm
Yeah.
sure with a lot of these questions.
Yeah.
What is another question that we put out there? And I think you might have a slide that covered it. What is required by the effective date of May 16, 2022?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on the effective date, the regulatory text is going to change. The way that I read the rule text is on May 16th, 2022, you need to file incident reports for type R and type C. Now, what's a little bit complicated there is the rule also gives you 6 additional months to figure out if your pipeline is type R or type C. So one of the issues that was raised in the petition for reconsideration is the reporting deadline should run concurrent with the asset classification deadline. Otherwise, you need to classify your pipe early and be ready to determine on the date of the rule if it's type R or type C, or you run the risk of not filing the correct report for the type R or the type C line. The other thing that becomes effective on the effective date is that 10-mile limitation on incidental gathering. So if you're going to be installing, an 11-mile incidental gathering line that goes into service on May 17th, that's a scenario where that 10-mile line or 11-mile line would be subject to that limitation and would likely need to be classified as transmission. Those are the two biggest ones that I can think of, but I do think there's some uncertainty as to, particularly on the reporting side and this asset classification deadline, how PHMSA is going to handle that in the, from May 16th until whatever that deadline is for determining your assets.
Thanks. Any idea or any thoughts on whether PHMSA will put out FAQs addressing questions not currently answered in the current final rule?
I fully expect PHMSA to issue FAQs on this rule. I cannot say with confidence that PHMSA will do draft FAQs for comment and then issue final FAQs. During the Trump administration, PHMSA was really good about that. When they developed FAQs, they would put the draft versions out for review and comment. In some cases, they even had public meetings so that industry could provide feedback on what was in the FAQs before they went final, because it's much easier to identify a problem and unwind it before a document is finalized. I don't know how the new administration is going to handle, comment on FAQs. I think they will issue them. It's just a question of, do they do a draft version first and then invite comment, or do they just issue final ones? And I would hope that they try to get the FAQs out so that they're meaningful in terms of these compliance deadlines. It's not going to do folks a lot of help to get an FAQ that comes out, after the effective date if their question relates to a compliance provision that kicks in on the effective date.
That's good insight. So there's one petition already filed by the industry groups for reconsideration. Is there other pending petitions, or do you expect any other litigation from other groups like environmental groups or other types of citizen groups on this rule?
And so the timeline for filing a petition for reconsideration with the agency has passed. API and GPA filed, nobody else did. So I don't expect any petitions for reconsideration. The deadline for seeking judicial review of the final rule, there's an 89-day deadline. So someone in theory could still seek judicial review of the final rule as it was issued by PHMSA. Even parties who decided not to seek reconsideration, they could bypass the reconsideration process and XYZ pipeline company could go to federal court. I don't know that anybody's going to do that. be really surprised. I haven't heard anybody suggest that. I do know legally GPA and API cannot seek judicial review and reconsideration at the same time. So they've sought reconsideration. Now, when PHMSA issues the decision on reconsideration, if that decision ends up changing the language in the final rule, that would have the effect of resetting some of these timelines on a go-forward basis. So again, if PHMSA were to change some rulemaking provision and issue a new final rule with that change, then I think, at least as to that new rulemaking provision, the deadlines would reset. Someone could challenge that within 30 days with a petition for reconsideration, and or they could seek judicial review. If PHMSA denies the petitions for reconsideration outright and doesn't grant any relief, and my understanding is that I think the only parties who could seek judicial review would be GPA and API, because the 89-day filing deadline as to them is told while they're seeking reconsideration.
That makes sense. Something to watch. Those are all the questions that I had in the chat. Are there any more? I'll ask one final time. Keith, anything else you want to mention?
No, thank you for the opportunity to do this. I've done several of these. I always get new questions, and I appreciate them. This has been a worthwhile session for me. I hope you all found it informative. And if you do have any questions that come up as you're rolling along, don't hesitate to reach out. I think my contact information will be in these slides when I send it over.
Sounds good. I'm not gonna let you off the hook just yet. I got one final question for you.
Is it an easy one or a hard?
Well, hold on. Let me see. Let me just. All right. There's two more. We do have a few minutes left, and I paid to ask, so I should have given people enough time to type. So that's on me. One is, I think it's, you can decide, is potential impact radius related to high consequence areas?
Well, yes, the formula that you use to calculate potential impact radius is prescribed in the integrity management regulations. So it's the same formula that you use. There is a wrinkle in the gas factor that you need to use for gathering versus transmission. So the gas factor that's authorized for dry gas transmission, I think, is 0.69. In the final rule, PHMSA says for gathering, you have to use, I think it's 0.73, the wet gas factor or the rich gas factor, to account for the potential for, I guess, additional liquid hydrocarbon product in the line, which under the calculation can create a larger PIR. I don't think it's significantly larger, but that's the one wrinkle. But the formula that's in the integrity management rules that you use to do PIR calculations and then figure out if you have an HCA, that formula is the same with the wrinkle that I mentioned about the gas factor.
Okay. And then the final question here is just asking to elaborate a little more on RP80 and the different ways you can classify gathering, and if there's any place to refer folks for additional information on that, any type of reference.
Yeah, so the first thing is I believe the first edition of RP80 is available online through API. It might be read-only access, but I believe anybody can access RP80. You might have to register with an email or something like that, but you should be able to view it. I would encourage folks to, if you haven't read RP80, the first edition, give it a read through. You'll see what I'm saying, talking about things being pretty complicated and challenging. RP80 gives operators a lot of discretion to, I would say, push the potential endpoints for production and the potential endpoints for gathering downstream. And that one of the extent of that discretion is one of the reasons why PHMSA felt like they should limit incidental gathering. Because again, an incidental gathering line is basically after you've determined that the 4 other endpoints can't allow you to extend gathering any further, then you can resort to this 5th endpoint, which is basically, okay, this is a pipeline that takes gas from one of the other endpoints and delivers it to another pipeline. So I'm going to continue the gathering function and call that gathering. PHMSA has also issued some letters of interpretation that are available on their website, where operators have come and asked the agency if the pipeline they are operating is a gathering line. And in some of those interpretations, they've talked about incidental gathering, the production provisions, things like that. I don't agree with all of those interpretations. I'll put that out there as a cautionary note that, I don't always agree with how PHMSA applies RP80. I think operators have a lot of discretion. They get a lot of pushback from PHMSA and state regulators when they do things that I think are perfectly permissible under RP80. And in the RP80 document itself, there are a bunch of diagrams and scenarios that lay out, that provide some useful guidance. And then there's a new edition of RP80, the 2nd edition. I would be careful in using the 2nd edition just because legally it's not incorporated by reference. So the things that are in the 2nd edition of RP80, at least right now, they're not relevant in determining your PHMSA compliance obligations. Work with the 1st edition. It's good to know what's in the 2nd edition, and maybe it might help clear up, what the 1st edition is saying. But I'll just say from a legal perspective, the 1st edition is the one that you have to work with.
Okay, thanks, Keith. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank Keith again for this very informative presentation. This recording and slides again will be available, and feel free to reach out with any additional questions, and we'll go from there. But thanks again to Keith, and thanks everyone.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Brad. I really enjoyed it.